Switzerland broke the rules in 2015, and it exposed how fragile global monetary control really is. Subscribe now, because this story explains the real mechanics behind modern money. Most people remember the Swiss franc jump, but few understand the real machinery behind it. The incentives, the pressures, the silent calculations that forced the Swiss National Bank to walk away from one of the most tightly defended currency pegs in modern financial history. The Swiss decision wasn't random, and it wasn't emotional. It was mathematical. To understand why this was unavoidable, we need to go back to 2011. Europe was in crisis mode. Greece was collapsing, confidence was evaporating, investors were looking for somewhere safe. And in global finance, when people panic, they run toward the Swiss franc. The franc is what economists call a safe haven currency. That means when risk rises, capital flows in. But this is where most people misunderstand Switzerland. When a country becomes a safe haven, it sounds positive. It sounds like strength. It sounds like protection. But in practice, it is dangerous. Because when everyone floods into your currency becomes too strong. The franc kept rising. Exports suffered. Tourism suffered. Profit margins shrank. Swiss products, especially high-value industries like watches, machinery, and pharmaceuticals, suddenly became more expensive to the world. So in September 2011, the Swiss National Bank took a step that shocked economists. It pegged the franc at 1.20 against the euro. That meant, officially, the franc would not be allowed to strengthen beyond that point. If the market tried to buy more francs, the SNB would create francs, sell them, and buy euros to defend the peg. This was the beginning of a massive balance sheet expansion. To defend the peg, the SNB had to keep creating francs and accumulating foreign currency assets. And because the euro crisis was deep and persistent, this wasn't a short-term problem. This became a structural commitment. By 2014, the SNB was sitting on foreign assets equal to nearly the size of the entire Swiss economy. A central bank was beginning to resemble a leveraged global asset fund. Internally, this became a point of tension. The SNB is conservative. It does not like uncontrolled exposure. And most importantly, it does not like infinite obligations. But then the final pressure arrived. The European Central Bank was preparing quantitative easing, QE. This meant Europe would print hundreds of billions of euros. A wave of new currency supply. A wave of devaluation. And Switzerland was still anchored to that currency. If they kept the peg, they would have to expand their balance sheet even more, at accelerating speed, to absorb the impact. This is the key point. The peg's defense, mathematically, was becoming infinite. And central banks only fear one thing more than volatility: infinite commitments. So, on January 15, 2015, without warning, the SNB removed the peg. The franc surged instantly. Markets broke. Brokers collapsed. Retail traders were wiped out. Some hedge funds disappeared within 24 hours. From outside, it looked like chaos. But from inside the SNB, this was not chaos. This was a reset. The peg had served its purpose. It bought Switzerland time through the euro crisis. Now, the SNB wanted freedom. But that freedom came with new consequences. Swiss exporters suffered immediately. Tourism became expensive. Multinationals were forced to adjust strategies. But here's where this story becomes more global. The SNB had become one of the biggest equity holders in the world, simply because it needed to park the value of all those accumulated reserves somewhere. When the world looked at Switzerland in 2015, it saw an old-fashioned central bank. But in reality, Switzerland was one of the largest passive shareholders of Apple, Microsoft, and other giants. Not by strategy, but by necessity. This is the part most people never understood. Central banks were being forced into investment roles, not because they wanted to, but because the financial architecture forced them into it. This is why the 2015 Swiss shock matters. It revealed that monetary control is not really control. It exposed that sovereign financial decisions are reactive, not independent. Switzerland was reacting to the euro crisis. Then it was reacting to ECB quantitative easing. And then the rest of the world reacted to Switzerland. The chain was global. Japan took notice because the yen is also a safe haven. Denmark took notice because it also has a euro link. And emerging markets took notice because they hold debt in foreign currency. The Swiss decision proved something uncomfortable. Even the most disciplined monetary system on earth could be cornered by external forces. Confidence in pegs changed worldwide. By the end of 2015, the SNB's credibility was not damaged. It was enhanced, because they showed that sometimes the most responsible decision is to stop pretending control exists where it does not. The peg had been an artificial equilibrium. It had served its purpose, but defending it forever was impossible. Swiss independence, in monetary terms, required accepting volatility. But accepting volatility preserved sovereignty. This is the paradox. By giving up control, Switzerland regained control. While the world was talking about shock, Switzerland was talking about flexibility. And that brings us to the deeper takeaway. In a globalized financial world, pegs don't collapse because of domestic failure. No peg exists in isolation. The franc move in 2015 was not a Swiss event. It was a global demonstration. It showed that modern money is interconnected and that no country, not even Switzerland, can fully separate from global monetary currents. This is why the Swiss episode is studied today, not because of the violence of the price move, but because of what it exposed, the limit of central bank power. Markets can be guided, markets can be influenced, but they cannot be frozen indefinitely. Artificial anchors eventually snap, and the Swiss case forced a global reevaluation of how financial stability is defined. For years, central banks had been treated like guardians who could engineer calm. They issued guidance, projections, forward policy statements, and markets assumed these institutions could maintain balance indefinitely. But Switzerland showed the limits. If the most credible, most disciplined, most conservative central bank in the world could abandon a policy overnight, then nothing was truly fixed. This realization didn't stay in academic circles. Banks changed risk models. Hedge funds revised assumptions. Institutional investors stopped treating pegs as immovable. In other words, the Swiss move changed how risk itself was measured. Because pegs are only stable as long as the central bank is willing to destroy itself defending them. And Switzerland was not willing. This began what analysts now call the era of monetary realism. Not optimism, not trust in stability. Realism, a recognition that currencies are not neutral. They are policy tools, and policy shifts abruptly when pressure reaches the limit. Switzerland simply admitted this early. Inside Zurich, Geneva, and Bern, the SNB didn't celebrate. They had created another problem, the strong franc. To counter that, negative interest rates were introduced. In the Swiss mindset, negative rates broke an old cultural understanding that money saved should be rewarded. But this was not ideology. It was a tactical lever. Because if the franc stayed too attractive, capital would continue to pour in. Negative rates were a deterrent, a message to global investors. Don't park capital here just because we are safe. That's the practical reality. When you are the safest currency, you attract too much demand. Too much demand destroys export competitiveness. So you must make safety expensive. Negative rates were not a trend, they were a defense. Swiss banks, traditionally symbols of conservatism, suddenly became part of a global experiment. Not because they wanted to, but because the world forced them into it. This is the part people ignore. Switzerland didn't act to shape the world. Switzerland acted because the world shaped them. Europe's QE forced the decision. Safe haven flows forced the strong franc. Global capital flows forced negative rates. At no point did the SNB act completely independently. They were navigating an environment where the external world dictated internal outcomes. This is the wider lesson. No modern central bank operates in isolation anymore. Every balance sheet is linked. Every peg is fragile. Every policy has global second-order effects. The Swiss episode made that visible. It made central bank power look less like a sovereign command and more like constant adaptation. Because that's what money has become, adaptation to global pressures, not control over them. And as the months passed after January 2015, this became the dominant interpretation inside financial research groups. Switzerland hadn't failed. Switzerland had simply reached the edge of the map before everyone else. That's why economists study this moment more than they study almost any other modern peg event. Because Switzerland was not a developing country. It was not a mismanaged economy. It wasn't a nation with weak institutions. It was the gold standard of fiscal discipline, breaking first. That fact alone forced every central banker, quietly, to rethink everything. Behind closed doors, in policy circles, In technical memos, the tone changed. Not publicly. Publicly, everyone kept saying, "We remain in control." But internally, there was recognition. If Switzerland couldn't permanently defend a peg, no one can. This is where the Swiss case becomes a blueprint, not a headline. Because the question stopped being, "Why did Switzerland remove the peg?" and became, "How long can any currency intervention survive in a globalized market?" This shift of framing was subtle, but decisive. And then came the next ripple: emerging markets. Poland, Hungary, Croatia, several countries had mortgage borrowers with Swiss franc loans because of lower rates. When the peg broke, their repayments exploded. That created political pressure far beyond Switzerland's borders. Politicians called the SNB irresponsible. But the real issue wasn't Switzerland. It was global leverage built on assumptions of permanent stability. The Swiss move simply revealed those assumptions were never safe to begin with. And that's the uncomfortable truth. The world had been building financial strategies on the illusion that central banks can maintain fixed value forever. Switzerland ripped the tape off that illusion in one morning. Markets weren't shocked because the franc moved. They were shocked because a central bank admitted it couldn't stop the move. From that point forward, institutional investors shifted their internal models one notch toward realism. Currency models became more probabilistic, less deterministic. Risk models became more fluid, less static. Because once the strongest central bank breaks, the myth of stability breaks with it.